The clock on the dashboard read 11:42 p.m. as Dr. Regina Washington let out a tired sigh, her shoulders finally relaxing after a long day. The streets of Atlanta were quiet now, a welcome change from the packed conference hall where she'd spent the last 12 hours. As Deputy Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, she'd just finished leading a groundbreaking presentation on new federal guidelines for fair policing practices. The conference had gone better than expected. She could still see the faces of the officers in the audience, some nodding along, others taking careful notes as she explained how building trust with communities could make their jobs easier and neighborhoods safer. A few had even stayed behind to share their own stories and ask questions about implementing these changes in their departments. Running her fingers through her short, curly hair, Regina smiled at the memory of one young officer who'd approached her after the presentation. "My grandmother marched for civil rights," he told her, eyes bright with purpose. "She'd be proud to see someone like you helping us do better." Those moments made the long hours worth it. The radio played softly in the background as she navigated her way home. She'd chosen to drive instead of fly, preferring the quiet time to gather her thoughts. Tomorrow she'd be back in Washington, buried in meetings and paperwork, but tonight was hers to decompress and reflect. Streetlights cast long shadows across her dark blue government-issued sedan as she turned onto a tree-lined suburban street. In her rearview mirror, Regina noticed the headlights of a patrol car that had been following her for the last few minutes. She didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were a common sight in this area. Still, something about the way it stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind made her instincts, honed by years of law enforcement experience, prickle with awareness. Regina double-checked her speed, exactly at the limit. Her registration was current, lights all working. There was no reason for concern, she told herself, even as she noticed the patrol car edging closer. She'd given hundreds of trainings on proper traffic stop procedures. She knew her rights, knew the protocols these officers were supposed to follow. The flash of blue and red lights suddenly illuminated her car's interior. Regina's heart sank, not with fear, but with a bone-deep wariness. Even after 20 years in law enforcement, even after rising to one of the highest positions in the FBI, even after literally just finishing a presentation on this very subject, here she was, being pulled over on a dark suburban street. Following procedure perfectly, she turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over in a well-lit area near a 24-hour convenience store. The dashboard camera would show she'd done everything by the book. She couldn't see the officer clearly in her mirrors, but she could tell from his movements as he approached that something was off. His walk was too aggressive, his posture too tense for a routine traffic stop. Regina took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd handled situations like this before. She had her FBI credentials right next to her driver's license. Once the officer saw who she was, this would all be cleared up. But as she watched him approach in her side mirror, that little voice of experience in the back of her mind kept whispering that this stop was different. This wasn't going to be routine at all. The beam of a flashlight suddenly flooded her car, and Regina squinted against its harsh glare. She could make out the officer's silhouette now, his hand already resting on his weapon as he approached her window. Before she could even reach for her credentials, before she could explain who she was, before she could do anything at all, his voice cut through the night air with a tone she knew all too well, one of unearned authority and barely disguised contempt. "License and registration." Officer Barrett barked, his flashlight beam unwavering in Regina's eyes despite the car's already well-lit interior. His tone was sharp enough to cut through steel, nothing like the professional courtesy she'd been teaching about just hours earlier. Regina kept her movements slow and deliberate. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my credentials now. They're in my purse on the passenger seat." She narrated her actions clearly, just as she'd taught countless others to do. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I don't care where they are, just hurry up," Barrett snapped, his free hand now resting more visibly on his holster. The gesture wasn't lost on Regina. It was an unnecessary show of force, a power play she'd seen too many times in footage across her desk. As she carefully reached for her purse, Barrett's voice cut through the night air again. "And why are you driving through this neighborhood at this hour?" The question came loaded with implications that made Regina's stomach turn. She'd moved through this world long enough to recognize what he was really asking. I'm heading home from a work conference, officer, Regina replied evenly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. She pulled out both her driver's license and her FBI credentials, holding them together where the light could clearly illuminate them. Barrett snatched the documents from her hand, barely glancing at them. Sure you are. Step out of the vehicle. His dismissive tone made it clear he hadn't even looked at her credentials. Officer Barrett, Regina read his nameplate in the reflection of her side mirror. I don't believe that's necessary. I've provided my identification, and I'd like to know the reason for this stop. Her words were measured, professional, the same words she'd used countless times in training sessions. Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job. Barrett's voice rose sharply. I said get out of the car. You're being uncooperative. He stepped back, hands still on his weapon, adopting an aggressive stance that set off every alarm bell in Regina's extensive law enforcement experience. Through her side mirror, Regina noticed movement across the street. A couple had come out onto their porch, phones raised, recording the scene. She felt a complex mix of emotions, relief at the witnesses, frustration at the familiar scenario playing out, and a deep sadness that even in her position, she was facing this situation. Officer, I want to cooperate, but I need you to tell me the reason for this stop. Regina kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. She'd taught this exact scenario, how officers should de-escalate, how they should communicate clearly, how they should respect citizens' rights. Barrett was breaking every protocol she'd outlined in her presentation just hours ago. You're crossing the double yellow line, driving erratically, Barrett claimed, though Regina knew it was false. Her decades of experience told her he was creating a pretext, building a narrative to justify his actions. The dashcam would prove otherwise, but that wouldn't help her in this moment. More lights were coming on in nearby houses, more phones were appearing in windows and doorways. The scene was gathering an audience, but rather than tempering Barrett's behavior, it seemed to fuel his aggression. Last warning. Exit the vehicle now. Barrett's voice had reached a dangerous pitch, one Regina recognized from countless video reviews of incidents gone wrong. She knew what came next in too many of those videos. Making a split-second decision, Regina began to open her door slowly, her movements still deliberate and calm. I am complying, Officer Barrett, but I want to state clearly that I'm doing so under protest. You haven't given me a valid reason for. Before she could finish, Barrett grabbed her car door, yanking it fully open. The sudden movement caught Regina off guard, causing her to stumble slightly as she emerged from the vehicle. She could hear gasps from the growing crowd of onlookers. Hands where I can see them, Barrett shouted, though Regina's hands were already raised, her FBI credentials still clutched in one of them, catching the glint of streetlights and phone flashlights from across the street. The scene had transformed from a simple traffic stop into street theater, with Regina unwillingly cast as the lead in a drama she'd spent her career trying to prevent. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by the murmurs of witnesses and the distant sound of another patrol car's siren growing closer. In that moment, standing on the street with her hands raised, Regina wasn't thinking about her rank or position. She was thinking about every case file on her desk, every viral video she'd reviewed, every testimony she'd heard from citizens in situations just like this. The only difference was she knew exactly what procedures Barrett was violating, and she knew this story would have a very different ending than he expected. The next few moments unfolded like scenes from the training videos Regina had shown just hours earlier at the conference. Officer Barrett moved behind her, ignoring the FBI credentials still visible in her raised hand. The cold metal of handcuffs pressed against her wrists as he roughly pulled her arms down and back. You're making a serious mistake, Officer Barrett, Regina said calmly, even as the cuffs bit into her skin. She could feel them being fastened too tightly, another violation of standard procedure. Those credentials you failed to read clearly show that I'm. Shut up. Barrett's voice cracked like a whip in the night air. You can explain yourself down at the station. He yanked her arms upward, sending a sharp pain through her shoulder. Regina bit back aghast, determined to maintain her composure. Across the street, the number of witnesses had grown. Phone cameras glinted like fireflies in the darkness. Regina could hear someone saying, "This isn't right," while another voice called out, "We're sending these videos to the news." A young couple stood closest, the woman speaking rapidly into her phone. "Yes, we need someone from Channel 7 News here right now." A police officer is roughing up a woman for no reason on Oak Street. Her partner was live-streaming the entire incident, his hands shaking with anger, but his phone steady. Regina's mind was running through protocols even as Barrett pushed her toward his patrol car. Standard procedure required officers to check credentials immediately, to adjust handcuffs if the suspect complained of pain, to clearly state the reason for arrest. Barrett had violated every single one of these policies. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Through the gathering crowd, Regina could see 2 more patrol cars pulling up, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. She recognized this response pattern. A show of force meant to intimidate not just her, but the witnesses. "Officer," Regina tried one more time, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "I am Dr. Regina Washington, Deputy Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The credentials you refused to read would confirm this. Your actions tonight are being recorded and constitute multiple violations of federal law." Barrett's grip on her arm tightened painfully, but she noticed his step falter slightly. Some part of her words had gotten through, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Not in front of the growing crowd. Not in front of his arriving fellow officers. "Lady, I've heard every excuse in the book," he growled, but there was a new note in his voice, the first hint of uncertainty. "You can sort it out at the station." The backup officers were emerging from their vehicles now, taking in the scene with confused expressions. One of them, an older officer with sergeant's stripes, was frowning as he approached, his eyes moving between Regina's professional attire, the gathering crowd of witnesses, and Barrett's aggressive stance. "What's going on here, Barrett?" the sergeant called out, his pace quickening as he got a clearer view of the situation. A young mother holding her phone up from her front porch called out. She showed him her FBI badge, and he didn't even look at it, just started manhandling her. Regina could feel Barrett's hands trembling slightly now where they gripped her arms. The confident bully of a few minutes ago was starting to realize he might have made a career-ending mistake. But instead of correcting course, he seemed determined to double down. "She was resisting, Sarge," Barrett said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Refused to comply with a lawful order." "I have complied with every lawful order," Regina stated clearly, knowing her words were being captured by dozens of phones. "What I have not done is consent to unlawful treatment by an officer who has demonstrated clear bias and a complete disregard for proper procedure." The sergeant was close enough now to see Regina's credentials still clutched in her cuffed hands. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something approaching horror. "Oh my God," he breathed, then snapped into action. "Barrett, remove those cuffs immediately." His voice carried the weight of 2 decades of experience and the clear understanding that they were all now part of what would become a major incident. But before Barrett could move, another voice cut through the night air. A voice Regina recognized from the conference earlier that day. "Dr. Washington, is that you?" A young officer pushed through the small crowd, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was one of the attendees who had stayed after her presentation to ask questions about implementing her recommended reforms. The same one who had spoken about his grandmother marching for civil rights. The tableau froze for a moment, Regina still in handcuffs, Barrett's hands betraying his growing panic, the sergeant looking like he'd just swallowed something extremely unpleasant, and dozens of phones recording every second. In that frozen moment, Regina thought about how this incident would be used in future training sessions, how it would demonstrate exactly why the reforms she championed were so desperately needed. The only sound was the soft whir of air conditioning units and the chirp of crickets in the warm Atlanta night as reality slowly dawned on Officer Barrett that he hadn't just made a mistake. He had handed Dr. Regina Washington, the FBI's leading expert on police reform, a real-world example of exactly why her work was necessary. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Regina sat in the surgeon's office, gently rubbing her wrists where the handcuffs had left angry red marks. The station had erupted into barely controlled chaos from the moment they'd arrived. News of who she was had spread through the building like wildfire. "Dr. Washington, I cannot even begin to express." The sergeant, whose nameplate read Anderson, was sitting behind his desk, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His face was a mix of embarrassment and genuine distress. "This is not who we are as a department." Regina looked at him steadily. "Actually, Sergeant Anderson, this is exactly who you are right now. And that's something we need to address." Her voice was calm but firm. She'd switched fully into her professional role now, despite her still aching shoulders. Through the office window, she could see Officer Barrett sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The young officer who had recognized her from the conference was giving his statement to Internal Affairs, gesturing as he described what he'd witnessed. The whole station was buzzing with activity, phones ringing nonstop as news of the incident spread. "Your officer didn't even bother to read my credentials," Regina continued, pulling out her phone to check the time, 1:15 a.m. He escalated a simple traffic stop into a physical confrontation while being recorded by multiple witnesses. "And most importantly, he did this the same day I gave a presentation to your department about these exact issues." Anderson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He wasn't at the training today. He called in sick. The words hung in the air, making the situation even more ironic. The door opened and a harried-looking woman in a suit rushed in. "Dr. Washington, I'm Chief Roberts." "I came as soon as I heard." She looked like she'd dressed in a hurry, her hair still slightly disheveled. "We've already reached out to the mayor's office and—" "Chief Roberts," Regina interrupted gently, "please have a seat. This is actually an opportunity." She gestured to an empty chair. Both the chief and the sergeant looked at her with surprise. They'd clearly been expecting anger, demands, threats of lawsuits, and federal investigations. Instead, Regina pulled out her tablet and opened her presentation from earlier that day. What happened tonight is a perfect case study. Officer Barrett's actions, while extreme, aren't unique. They're symptoms of deeper issues that we can address together. A small crowd had gathered outside the office, officers and staff trying to catch glimpses through the windows. Regina could see Barrett being led to an interview room by Internal Affairs. His earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by the stunned look of someone watching their career crumble in real time. "The videos are already online," Chief Roberts said quietly, holding up her phone. "They're going viral. The media's outside." Regina nodded. "Good, because here's what we're going to do." She turned her tablet around, showing them the slide about community trust and accountability. "Tonight doesn't have to be just another scandal. It can be the starting point for real change." She pulled up an email on her phone. It had already arrived from her office in Washington. They'd seen the videos too. "My team is ready to work with you. Not just to handle this incident, but to implement comprehensive reforms. You can be an example for other departments across the country." The sergeant and chief exchanged glances. They'd expected to spend the night doing damage control. Instead, they were getting a master class in turning a crisis into an opportunity for transformation. Outside the office, more officers had gathered. The young officer from the conference was showing others something on his phone, probably footage from her presentation earlier that day. The contrast between her words then and what had happened just hours later couldn't have been clearer. "We'll need to start with a complete review of Officer Barrett's record," Regina continued, her fingers moving swiftly across her tablet. "Not to punish, but to understand. Every complaint, every use of force incident, every traffic stop. We need to identify the patterns that led to tonight." A fresh wave of commotion swept through the station as more media arrived outside. Camera lights were visible through the front windows and phones were ringing constantly. But inside the surgeon's office, Regina was already laying out a plan that went far beyond one bad traffic stop. "Your department can show that when something like this happens, you don't just react, you respond with real, meaningful change." She looked at both officers. "Are you ready to do the work?" The chief and sergeant looked at each other again, then back at Regina. In the harsh fluorescent light of the police station at 1:30 in the morning, with chaos swirling around them and career-ending headlines being written, they were being offered a lifeline. Not just a way out of this crisis, but a path toward becoming the kind of department they always claimed to be. Through the window, Regina could see Barrett being escorted out of the interview room, his face ashen. He glanced toward the office, and for a brief moment their eyes met. In that look, Regina saw something she'd seen many times before, the beginning of understanding. Sometimes, she knew, the hardest lessons came from the biggest mistakes. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the temporary office the department had given Regina. 3 days had passed since the incident, and she'd barely left the station. Stacks of files covered her desk: Officer Barrett's complete service record, civilian complaints, and traffic stop data from the past 5 years. Dr. Washington. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Annie Chen, a local community organizer, stood in the doorway clutching a thick folder. "We've gathered more statements from the community. You need to see these." Regina gestured to a chair, pushing aside some papers to make room for the new documents. Over the past few days, her incident had sparked something unexpected. People were coming forward with their own stories. The trickle had become a flood. 27 new cases, Annie said, spreading the papers across the desk, all involving similar traffic stops. Most people were too afraid to file formal complaints before, but now, she trailed off, watching Regina flip through the statements. Regina nodded, adding these new files to her growing database. Her laptop screen showed a map of the city, with red dots marking each incident. A pattern was emerging, clear as day. The same neighborhoods, the same time of night, the same escalation tactics. The door opened again, and Chief Roberts entered with 2 internal affairs officers. The chief looked tired. She'd been dealing with non-stop media calls and city council meetings. "The mayor's office is on board with your reform proposal," she said, dropping into a chair. "They've seen the preliminary findings." Regina turned her laptop around to show them the map. "It's not just Barrett," she explained. "He's a symptom of a larger problem. Look at these traffic stop numbers." She pulled up a chart showing stark disparities in how different officers handled routine stops. Some officers have 0 complaints, while others— One of the internal affairs officers leaned forward, frowning at the data. "How did we miss this pattern?" "Because you weren't looking for it," Regina said gently. "But now we have a chance to fix it." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard where she outlined her action plan. Phase 1 is already underway, gathering community input and analyzing historical data. Annie pulled out her phone, showing them a social media post that had gone viral. It was a side-by-side video. Regina's presentation at the conference about proper traffic stop procedures, paired with footage of her own stop by Barrett. The contrast was striking. "The community wants to be part of the solution," Annie explained. "People are volunteering to join oversight committees, offering to share their experiences. They see this as a chance for real change." Regina's phone buzzed. Another message from her team in Washington. They'd been working around the clock, analyzing similar cases across the country. "This isn't just about one department anymore," she said, reading the message. "Other cities are reaching out, wanting to implement these reforms before they have their own incident." Chief Roberts stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the station's parking lot. A group of officers was gathering for their shift change briefing. "Some of my officers are resistant to change," she admitted. "They think this is an attack on them." "Then let's show them it's not," Regina replied, pulling up another file on her laptop. "Look at these numbers from departments that have already implemented similar reforms. Officer safety improved. Community trust increased. Even conviction rates went up because witnesses were more willing to cooperate." The young officer who had recognized Regina that night poked his head in. "Dr. Washington, the community meeting is starting in 10 minutes. We've got a full house." Regina gathered her materials, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. The past few days had been intense, but something remarkable was happening. People who had never talked to each other were now working together: police officers, community leaders, local government officials. As they walked to the community center next door, Regina could see the crowd through the windows. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. Officers in uniform mixed with community members, all there to be part of the change. "That's the real story here," Regina said to Amy as they approached the entrance. "Not what happened that night, but what's happening now. People coming together, facing hard truths, doing the work to make things better." Inside, the buzz of conversation filled the room. On one wall hung a large banner, "Building Trust Together." Below it, Officer Barrett's face stayed out from dozens of news articles about the incident. But next to those articles were new ones, highlighting the reforms already underway. Regina took a deep breath as she prepared to address the crowd. In her hand was the speech she'd prepared, but she knew she wouldn't need it. The real power was in the stories being shared in that room. Stories of fear and frustration, yes, but also stories of hope and determination to create something better. The room quieted as she stepped up to the podium. Looking out at the diverse faces before her, Regina saw something she hadn't seen in years of working on police reform: genuine willingness to change. Sometimes, she realized, it took a moment of crisis to open the door for transformation. 2 weeks after the incident, Regina sat in her temporary office reviewing the latest findings. The wall behind her desk had become a timeline of discoveries, each revelation more troubling than the last. But today felt different. Today, they were finally moving from uncovering problems to implementing solutions. "These numbers are staggering," said Lieutenant Torres, shaking her head as she looked at the latest report. The lieutenant had been assigned to help with the investigation, and over the past weeks, she'd become one of Regina's strongest allies in the department. Regina nodded, pointing to a particularly telling graph. Officer Barrett's traffic stops showed a clear pattern. 8 out of 10 were minorities, mostly women driving alone at night. But here's what's interesting: his early records don't show this bias. It developed over time, and nobody noticed. The door opened, and Amy Chen walked in with Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who'd come forward after seeing the viral video. "I've been scared to drive at night for years," Mrs. Thompson said, settling into a chair. "After what happened with that officer 3 years ago." Regina pulled out a file. She'd already found Mrs. Thompson's incident report, buried under paperwork and marked resolved despite no real investigation. It was one of dozens they'd uncovered, forming a pattern that stretched back years. "The good news," Regina said, turning to her laptop, "is that we're already seeing changes. Look at these numbers from the past 2 weeks." She showed them a new chart. Since the incident, complaints about traffic stops had dropped dramatically. Officers were following the new protocols, knowing they were under scrutiny. Lieutenant Torres leaned forward. "The body camera compliance is at 100% now. Officers are actually thanking us for the new review system. It protects them too." She pulled up footage from a recent traffic stop, showing an officer handling a tense situation perfectly, de-escalating what could have become a confrontation. The young officer who'd recognized Regina that night, now part of the reform implementation team, knocked on the door. "Dr. Washington, the news crew is here for your interview, and the police academy wants to know if you can speak to the new recruits next week." Regina checked her watch. Between media appearances, community meetings, and officer training sessions, their days were packed. But each interaction was another chance to reinforce the message that change was possible. "Did you see the latest survey results?" Amy asked, pulling out her tablet. They'd been tracking community sentiment since the incident. The numbers were encouraging. People reported feeling more confident about interacting with police, more willing to report crimes, more trusting of the system. "Officer Barrett's hearing is tomorrow," Lieutenant Torres reminded them quietly. The room fell silent for a moment. Barrett's case had become a symbol of both what was wrong and what could be fixed. Regina had visited him once during the investigation. She'd found him different from that night, subdued, reflective. "I never thought I was that guy," he told her. "The one who'd end up on the news for doing something wrong. I didn't see what I was becoming." The wall-mounted TV in the office was showing clips from body camera training sessions. Officers were learning new approaches, practicing de-escalation techniques, understanding how their own biases could affect their actions. "We've had calls from 12 other police departments this week," Annie mentioned, checking her notes. "They want to implement similar reforms. They're saying, we don't want to be the next viral video." Regina stood up, walking to the window. The view had become familiar over the past weeks. Officers and civilians coming and going, working together in ways they never had before. Yesterday, she'd watched a group of veteran officers having lunch with community leaders, sharing stories and building bridges. "You know what's really changing?" Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "It's not just the rules and procedures. It's how people see each other. Last week, an officer helped my grandson change a flat tire. Instead of being scared, my grandson got to see the police as helpers. That's what we needed all along." The news crew was setting up in the conference room down the hall. Regina gathered her materials, including the latest statistics and success stories. But she knew the most powerful part of her message wouldn't be in the numbers, it would be in the human stories of change. "Remember when we started this?" Lieutenant Torres asked, helping Regina organize her presentation. "People said it couldn't be done. That departments couldn't change, that communities couldn't trust again, that officers wouldn't adapt." Regina smiled, thinking of all they'd accomplished in just 2 weeks. The mandatory bias training sessions that officers now actively participated in. The community oversight board that was already making a difference. The new recruitment policies that would help build a more diverse force. As she walked to the interview, Regina passed the wall where they'd posted before and after scenarios. Actual situations handled differently under the new protocols. Each case showed how simple changes in approach could lead to better outcomes for everyone. The news crew was ready, cameras set up to capture what had become known as the Atlanta model of police reform. But Regina knew the real story wasn't about models or protocols or statistics. It was about people choosing to change, to learn, to do better. It was about turning a moment of crisis into an opportunity for transformation. 6 months had passed since that night on the quiet Atlanta street. Regina stood at the podium in Washington, D.C., looking out at a sea of faces, police chiefs, community leaders, and lawmakers from across the country. They'd all come to learn about what was now being called the Turning Point Initiative. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Regina began, clicking to her first slide. "But sometimes a single moment can open our eyes to what needs to change." The screen showed the viral video of her traffic stop, now viewed over 50 million times. In the front row sat Chief Roberts and Lieutenant Torres, who'd flown in from Atlanta to share their department's transformation story. Behind them, Amy Chen sat with Mrs. Thompson and other community members who'd become the backbone of the reform movement. 6 months ago, I experienced what thousands of others had experienced before me, Regina continued, her voice carrying through the packed auditorium. The difference was, I was in a position to do something about it. But the real heroes of this story are the people who chose to change. She clicked to the next slide, showing the remarkable statistics from Atlanta. Civilian complaints down by 70%. Officer satisfaction up by 45%. Community trust levels at their highest in department history. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. "Last week, I got a letter," Regina said, pulling out a piece of paper. It was from Officer Barrett's daughter. The room fell silent. Barrett had resigned from the force after the incident, but what happened next had surprised everyone. She wrote to tell me about her father's transformation, how he's now working with community groups, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a message of hope. How he finally understood what his own biases had done, not just to others, but to himself. The screen showed images from recent community events in Atlanta. Officers playing basketball with local kids. Community members attending police family picnics, real relationships being built, one interaction at a time. But Atlanta was just the beginning, Regina continued. In the past 6 months, 37 police departments across the country have adopted our reform model. Over 500 officers have gone through our new training program. And most importantly, communities are starting to trust again. Lieutenant Torres stood up to share the practical changes they'd implemented. The new traffic stop protocols that had reduced tensions and improved safety for both officers and civilians. The community oversight board that had become a model for other cities. The recruitment changes that were bringing in a more diverse group of officers. "We didn't just change policies," the lieutenant explained. "We changed our entire approach to community relations. And you know what? It made our jobs easier. When people trust you, they help you. When they see you as part of their community, they work with you to keep it safe." Amy Chen took the stage next, sharing stories from the community perspective. She talked about the elderly woman who'd called the police for help last week, the same woman who'd been too scared to interact with officers just months before. "This isn't just about preventing bad incidents," Amy said. "It's about building something better, something that works for everyone." Regina returned to the podium for the final part of the presentation. "Congress is now considering national legislation based on our initiative," she announced. "But laws alone won't fix this. Real change happens in hearts and minds, in daily interactions, in small moments of understanding." The screen showed a recent photo that had gone viral. Officer Barrett at a community center, sharing his story with a group of new police recruits. His face showed something that hadn't been there that night 6 months ago: humility, understanding, and a genuine desire to help others learn from his mistakes. Some people asked me why I didn't sue, why I didn't push for harsher punishment, Regina said. The answer is simple. Punishment doesn't create change. Education does. Understanding does. And sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most important lessons. She clicked to her final slide, a simple before and after. The before showed the night of her traffic stop, tension and fear visible in every frame. The after showed last week's community police graduation ceremony, where officers and civilians stood together, smiling, united in purpose. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed on a dark street, Regina concluded. Today, we're all working together to build something new. That's not just a happy ending, it's a new beginning. The applause that filled the room wasn't just for her speech. It was for every person who'd chosen to be part of the change, for every officer who'd learned to see beyond their biases, for every community member who'd chosen trust over fear, for every small step toward a better way of working together. As Regina looked out at the crowd, she saw faces from every part of this journey. The young officer who'd recognized her that night, now training others in the new protocols. Mrs. Thompson, who'd gone from being afraid of the police to serving on the oversight board. Even Officer Barrett's daughter, who'd found the courage to reach out and share her father's story of transformation. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. And as Regina gathered her materials, she knew that somewhere, on another quiet street, another interaction was happening. But maybe this time, thanks to everything they'd learned and changed, it would have a different ending.